get his take on the economy and all the things that are going on here at the Dealmaker Summit, we have Jim Grant. You know him as the editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer. Jim Grant, good to have you with us on Bloomberg.
Jim, thank you.
And it's great to be here with you in really next door to the house that J.P. Morgan built, the Morgan Library. It seems
Great bones.
Yeah. And it seems almost apocryphal that we should be here because he figures in this week's edition of Grant's Interest Rate Observer, but it has more to do with the sort of change in the economy that's been imposed by the government, specifically requiring banks to almost come up with living wills, as you described.
As we speak, the nation's too big to fail banking cohort is busy drawing up kind of pre-planning pre-planned funerals. New financial regulations require these banks to draw up blueprints for their own dissolution the next time they skate on the cusp of insolvency, which might be 2 weeks from now or 2 years from now, but everyone is more or less certain that they will again get near the edge. So the next time the thinking goes, instead of the taxpayers bailing them out, they themselves, referring to the documents so carefully drawn up, will take themselves apart, offer themselves up for sale, and walk away quietly into the sunset. Does that ring true?
Does that have any connection to reality?
None. And so J.P. Morgan Chase, which is the surviving elements of the ancient banks that were, if nothing else, solvent, are now busily conforming with federal regulations. And I'm wondering, if J.P. Morgan himself were on the premises, how he would react to some a functionary from the FDIC saying, by the way, it only takes 500 hours. Would you please mind drawing up the plan for the insolvency of the institution you are running? Well, picture does not come into focus. So we at Grant's Interest Rate Observer, Pimm, thought that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And inasmuch as the Federal Reserve is itself a mighty financial institution, too big to fail, and inasmuch as it was the author of this feast of disaster, or a principal author, why not the Fed itself be required to draw up a living will? So we made...
But you didn't spend 500 hours doing it. You were much more efficient.
About 90 minutes.
90 minutes, yeah. All right, an hour and a half.
It was pro bono. We thought the least we could do for the public good.
So what did you come up with about the dissolution of the Federal Reserve?
Well, this was an exercise in satire in service of a point. And it was a send-up, and we said, well, first of all, we need to name an executor of the Federal Reserve, and who better than Ron Paul, the dashing libertarian congressman from Texas, who despises everything that the Fed ever did, will do, and has thought about doing. So that's first of all, get that out of the way.
All right, so Ron Paul becomes the executive.
Right. So we asked ourselves, what does the Fed do for a living? Well, for one thing, in a kind of a pedestrian way, it moves currency and checks and coins. So the Brinks could take over some of the trucking, and Coinstar certainly could be interested in the nickels, dimes, and quarters. And then what else does it do? Well, it manages this immense portfolio, of which more in a moment, $2.2 trillion of mortgages and governments and other such things. And why not farm that out to professional money managers? So we nominated our friends at Anley Mortgage Management and Redwood Trust to take over that. And then, of course, there is the black art of central planning that the Fed has taken upon itself to perform. This was never in its charter or in any sense in the enabling legislation. And we think that that's better left undone. So we'll let Ron Paul handle the legacy of the central economic planning. And on like that. As I say, the exercise was over almost before we knew it. It was great fun, and certainly people will say, well, wasted time. It is preposterous. Don't waste our time with it. But we think that when you begin thinking about the state of affairs in which the government can order these banks, which are so beholden to the taxpayers, to make plans for their own failure, it drives home the point that we have been on the road to the socialization of credit for many, many decades, and now we're kind of there. I mean, of course, the next time there is a crisis, the taxpayers will ride to the rescue. They will subsidize these great, big, dumb banks with their dollars and with their foregone interest income, because interest rates will again be driven to zero, or, as a fellow at Citi so helpfully suggests, less than zero.
What are regulators what are people in Washington so afraid of? I mean, why are they so afraid to, in a sense,
maybe they see the books?
Well, maybe that's it. Maybe they have more information than we do.
I think that what ails us, in a way, is the preceding absence of crisis. In other words, the year upon year of good times, the sense that gained credence in the financial community that nothing really bad would happen because the Fed would be there, all of this built up this kind of dry forest floor of dry tinder, and it blew up.
Jim, during the break, we were just talking about this idea of the fear that seems to have gripped regulators, and as a result, they seem to be trying to lead the economy in one direction when isn't capitalism regenerative? I mean, people will figure it out after the dust settles.
Well, regulators are a little bit like the rest of us in that they tend to look back when they ought to be looking forward. And you look back at the history of financial cycles, and at the bottom or at the top, people collectively, almost invariably, have the wrong thought. And regulators, perhaps because they are more risk-averse than capitalists, perhaps are even more prone to this all-too-typical error. Regulators, without fail, get really, really careful after all horses have left the barn that's blazing in the background. I think, but so great was the trauma of this crisis that you can magnify all of these tendencies and attitudes by some important number. But nothing really new here.
Well, that's the point, right? I mean, the fact that you're going to have these cycles and to try to legislate human activity is very difficult at best and impossible.
One of America's great strengths, rarely discussed, has been its capacity to deal with failure. Almost any society can deal with successes. But the idea, the ability to confront error, to admit it, to reprice it, and then to try the next thing, to try to form a business in the face of error, in the face of one's own failings. That's one of the things that has made this economy so resilient. Contrast Japan, where there is seemingly there's a deeply ingrained aversion to meeting error, repricing it, and to addressing it and doing the next thing,
rather than learning from it and actually building
or
upon
getting
it.
over it. So if we are going to wallow in the last thing by appointing Elizabeth Warren to supervise our every jot and tittle on Wall Street, if we're going to wallow in it through condemnation and rough rhetoric from the White House, it doesn't, it's not helpful.
Now, as just an example, a modest example of the regenerative quality and people taking risks, I know that you're going to be spending some time in London, and that's a new thing for Grant's Interest Rate Observer.
London's not coming to us.
They're not coming here, so you're going there. What are you doing in London?
Well, we put on a couple of conferences a year, and they always sell out, and we figured that we'd try to sell one out in London.
But that's a risk, too.
Of course it is. Grant's Interest Rate Observer is never going to move the GDP, but we try to set an example for Alcoa and JP Morgan and the other companies by always just looking for something else, by trying to be better than we have been, and are successful. Let's see, 1 out of 3 get you in the Hall of Fame? Yeah, we try.
You'll try.
And London is an example of something that we're trying.
Now, one of the other examples coming from Grant's Interest Rate Observer, at least from what I always take away with it, is I have to increase my library time because you're always pointing readers to interesting books and historical.
Read books, get rich.
There you go.
That's our motto. Don't write books, get rich. Read books, get rich.
Well, I'll leave the writing of the books to you. I mean, I have read The Trouble with Prosperity that you penned, but in a recent issue, you talked about a gentleman named Willis.
Oh, H. Parker Willis.
H. Parker Willis. Maybe you can enlighten people.
Well,
who was H. Parker Willis, and why is it important for people to know this?
Willis was present at the creation of the Federal Reserve. He was one of the draftsmen of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. He was the right-hand man of Senator Carter Glass of Virginia, who was indeed the father of the Fed and whose name is attached to the Glass-Steagall Act, 1933. So Willis was also the first secretary of the Federal Reserve Board. He knows this institution. He wrote a book in 1936. The title's not important, it's out of print. This book was a lamentation about the low estate of central banking in America. The Fed had lost its way in 1936. It was in business, opened its doors in 1914. By 1936, it had eaten the forbidden fruit. It was in the business of guiding the economy, of managing the economy, of manipulating this aggregate and that. And Willis said, for Pete's sake, you can't know that. You can't. The GDP data are not reliable enough for you to do what you think you are doing. It's a wonderful tract against the tendency of the Fed to do what it has so lethally done to this economy, in my opinion, which is to steer us. So in the interest of raising the GDP, it thinks it can measure it, by the way. In the interest of raising the GDP, it presses interest rates to zero, pouring out immense volumes of econometric studies in support of this dubious enterprise. Hey, Fed, just attend to the dollar. That's it. No inflation. So just do one thing. No, it is, you've heard of mission creep? These guys are the mission creeps par excellence.
Well, it seems appropriate to be mentioning H. Parker Willis here in the home of J.P. Morgan. Perhaps he even walked these halls, at least in the house of J.P. Morgan at one point.
I'll look into that.
All right. I look forward to getting the results. Thank you very much, as always.
You're entirely welcome, Pimm. Nice to see you.
Grant's Interest Rate Observer. Good luck in London. Good luck with the conference.